Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Tapas Ray. I teach at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. This is the first of the three modules on phrase structure grammar, which is part of the course on advanced syntax. In this module, we look at the constituents of a sentence and also constituents of phrases. What we do is we consider the building blocks of a sentence. Like we see how a sentence is made of phrases and a phrase is made of words. Now, let us first consider a simple sentence like a boy met a girl. Look at the screen. This sentence can be divided into two parts. Like we say, a boy is a noun phrase here and met a girl is a verb phrase. We say that this sentence has two parts or two constituents. One is the noun phrase and the other is the verb phrase. And this can be said with the help of bracketing. Look at 2. In 2 we have given label bracketing for this sentence. It says that this sentence is an S. As you know, the symbol S is used for sentences and the symbol NP is used for the noun phrase and the symbol VP is used for the verb phrase. So you use square brackets to say that, and they are labeled, and therefore it is called label bracketing. And in 2 you can see that the noun phrase starts with A and ends with boy. That is the noun phrase. So we have an opening bracket there and a closing bracket for the noun phrase. And then we have an opening bracket for the verb phrase, which is met a girl, and a closing bracket for the verb phrase. And then we also have, as you can see, an opening bracket for the sentence and a closing bracket for the sentence. And the labels are given like S, NP, and VP. We can also use tree diagrams to say the same thing. Like you see in 3, here S is divided into two parts or two constituents, the noun phrase, which is a boy, and the verb phrase, which is met a girl. This is called a tree diagram. And this S at the top, this is called the initial symbol, and the lines that you see from S going from S to NP or S to VP, they are called branches. And here NP and VP, they are called also nodes. They are the nodes. NP is a node, S there is a node, and VP there is a node. And we say that S is the mother node here, and NP and VP are the daughter nodes of the S. We can also write a rule to say the same thing, that the S consists of an NP and a VP. That rule is given in 4. You can see that S, and then after S you have an arrow there which stands for something like S goes into, or S is rewritten as NP and VP. So this is a rule for what a sentence can have, or what kind of a sentence we have in 1 here. Now let's move on to talk about NPs. As we saw, an S can have constituents like an NP and a VP. Similarly, the constituents like NPs and VPs and other phrases also can have constituents of themselves. Like an NP must have an N. You cannot have a noun phrase without a noun. So for example, in the first example you find NP has only a noun, John, which is a noun. But NPs also can have other things, other nodes. Like in the second one we have a determiner, which is an article. We generally have two kinds of determiners. One is an article. Words like A, N and D, they are considered to be articles. We can also have, under the determiner, we can also have a possessive marker like his or her. Like we can say his car or her friend. So a determiner can occur before a noun within a noun phrase. There are also other constituents that can occur within a noun phrase. For example, in 3 we have an adjective phrase, tall. Tall is an adjective, and so we have 3 constituents in 3. A, which is an article, which is considered to be a determiner, and then tall, which is an adjective, and then a noun, boy. Since all of these are noun phrases, they must have a noun, and all of them here have a noun, but not all of them need to have articles or adjective phrases, and therefore in one we have neither a determiner nor an adjective phrase, but we just have a noun. Now look at 4, the noun phrase in 4. Here you have, in addition to a determiner, you have an ordinal and you have a quantifier before the noun. Ordinals are things like first, second, third, and quantifiers are 2, 5, 10, etc. And then in the other noun phrase, that is 5, you have an adjective phrase and you also have a noun phrase before the noun. So these are the 2 noun phrases where you have an adjective phrase, you have a quantifier, you have an ordinal, etc. And now look at 6, which is a long noun phrase where you have a predeterminer which comes before the determiner, then a quantifier, then an adjective phrase, and then you also have a preposition phrase after the noun. So now we can write a rule for these noun phrases that we saw. We saw that all the noun phrases that we looked at, all of them have a noun. Some of them, or actually one of them has a predeterminer, some of them have determiners, a few of them have ordinals, maybe one of them has a quantifier, and a couple of them have adjective phrases, and one has a preposition phrase. So we would like to say that these things like a predeterminer, a determiner, an ordinal, a quantifier, an adjective phrase, and the noun phrase before the noun, and the preposition phrase, these are optional elements in this noun phrase. However, the noun itself is an obligatory constituent. Why do we say that? Because all the noun phrases have a noun. Without a noun, there can't be a noun phrase. But not all the noun phrases that we looked at have a preposition phrase, or not all of them have a predeterminer or a determiner or an ordinal. So when we write a rule for the noun phrase, this is a rule not for all noun phrases, but this is a rule for all the noun phrases that we just saw. And when we write a rule for the noun phrase, for the noun phrases that we saw, we say that these are optional elements, and therefore we put all of them in brackets, and they are round brackets. So you see that predeterminer is within round brackets, determiner is within round brackets, ordinal is within round brackets, quantifier is within round brackets, adjective phrase and noun phrase and preposition phrase, all of them are in round brackets, which says that they are optional. However, the noun is not within brackets, which says that it is obligatory. Then if we look at the determiner, we find that a determiner can be of two types. Either it can be an article like I said, a or an or the, things like that, or a possessive like his or her or their. So it's not that you can have both an article or a possessive, but what you must have is either an article or a possessive. You can't have both of them. And therefore, when it is a case of alternatives, like it's not that article is optional or possessive is optional or both must be there, what we do is we put them in curly brackets like you see in 8. So there are two ways of using brackets. Round brackets are used for optional elements, and curly brackets are used to say that one can substitute the other, one can come in the place of the other. They are alternatives. So a determiner can be an article or can be a possessive, and therefore we put them in curly brackets. Now let us consider the verb phrases. The verb phrase can be very simple, like you say John writes, or it can have more things, like it can have a modal. You can say John can write. So we say that like a noun phrase must have a verb phrase must have a verb. It may have also a modal. We also say that before the verb, which we call actually main verb, in 4 for example, you have an auxiliary. What is an auxiliary? Now we know that things like modals are auxiliaries, or even a perfective verb like have, or a passive verb where we use be verb. These are called auxiliary verbs. Why do we call them auxiliary verbs? Because one reason why we call them auxiliary verbs is they can be used as operators. Now what do we mean by operators? Look at 1A and 2 and 2A. John writes poems, but we cannot move writes and make it a question. But John can write poems, we can move can and make it a question. Why is this? This is because here can is an auxiliary verb, but writes is not an auxiliary verb. So only auxiliary verbs can be moved to the sentence initial position, and we can make a yes no question like we have done in 2A. And auxiliary verbs also can be used just before a negative marker like not. For example, John writes poem, the sentence that we have in 1, the negative of it will not be John writes not poems. So we cannot use not after writes, because writes is not an auxiliary verb. It's not used as an operator. However, since can is an auxiliary verb which can be used as an operator, that is, we can add not to it, we can use not after can, and therefore this is considered to be an operator and an auxiliary verb. The other auxiliary verbs, as I said, are perfective markers like have, for example. They have written a few books, and you see that we can make a question from that. Have they written a few books? Because it's an auxiliary verb, it can be moved. Similarly, we can use not after have and get a negative sentence. So we can say they have not written a few books. And then look at how perfective is divided. Perfective is not just have. Like we know that when we say they have written a few books, one change that we make when we add a perfective marker is that we use have or has or had, plus we use the participle form of the verb. For example, write becomes written, and therefore we say that the perfective actually consists of two things. One is have plus a suffix like en, which is attached to the main verb or to the verb that occurs. So in 3 you see that en gets attached to right, and that is how we get have written. Similarly, we see that in have done we have perfective is have plus en plus do, and in have brought have then en then bring. Now you might say, how is it that we get brought here, not bring in or something? That is, en is not always realized as en, although we call it en. Sometimes it can be realized in a different way, and that is how with bring we get have brought. Now look at 4c. Here we have the verb phrase have sent, and then 4d we have the verb phrase have cut. You can see that in have cut, the affix that is added to cut is actually a zero affix, zero morpheme. So here, even if we assume that en is the perfective suffix, it doesn't become cutten, but it becomes cut. Now let us consider the passive auxiliaries. Look at 8. The boy is beaten every day, and you can see that that passive auxiliary verb can also move, and therefore we say that it's an auxiliary. Is that boy beaten every day, or that boy is not beaten every day? And here we say that the passive actually consists of, again, the be verb, which is an auxiliary, and the suffix here is en. So en is again attached to the verb beat, and that is how we get is beaten. As you know, be verb can be realized as is or are or am, depending on the subject. If the subject is first person or second person or third person, or is it singular or plural. Now look at some sentences 12 and 13, where we have the auxiliary verbs and then the verb. In 12a we analyze the verb, not the full verb phrase, but just the auxiliary verb and the main verb. So here we have a modal plus a perfective plus the verb, and then in 13b we have will be visiting. This is a tree diagram for will be visiting, and here we have will, which is a modal. Then we have progressive marker here, be plus ing, which is a progressive marker. So for progressive we use the verb be plus the suffix ing. And now look at sentences 14 and 15. Here in 14 we have been teaching. The tree in 14 is for have been teaching. Here we have perfective and progressive, which is be plus ing plus teach. And in 15 we have will be declared. Here will is a modal, and then we have passive be plus en and the verb declare. Now look at 16. This is an interesting example, because in this sentence we have a verb phrase in which we have all types of auxiliaries. Generally we don't get all types of auxiliaries in a verb phrase, but it's possible to do that, and that is why we have given this example. And as you can see in this verb phrase in 16a, we have a modal, may have been being interrogated. So we have a modal which is may, and then we have the perfective marker which is have, and the suffix for perfective marker is en. Then we have the progressive marker which is be, and the suffix for progressive is ing. Then we have passive. Again, passive, as you know, has a be verb passive is realized as be verb plus an en suffix. So we have be verb there and en suffix, then the main verb interrogate. Now what happens, how do we get may have been being interrogated from this tree diagram? May remains may, and then we have, after have we have en. Now this suffix is attached to the next verb, as I said earlier. So this en is attached to be, to the be of the progressive. So we get have been, and then we have in progressive we have be plus ing, and that ing is attached to the be of passive, and that is how we get being. That ing is attached to passive of be and we get being, and then we have the suffix of passive which is en, which is attached to interrogate, and we get interrogated. So this is an interesting example of how suffixes are attached to the next verb in the verb phrase. So you have may, have been, where en is added to be, and may have been being, where ing is added to the be of passive, and interrogated, where en of passive is added to interrogate, and we get interrogated. So in this module we looked at the constituents of a sentence. We looked at a very simple sentence and we saw that it can have two constituents, a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and we tried to show the constituents with the help of label bracketing and also with the help of tree diagrams. And then we also tried to write a rule for the noun phrase. We showed how a noun phrase consists of a noun phrase and a verb phrase, how the rule is written. And then we looked at noun phrases, simple noun phrases having only a noun, noun phrases having a determiner or an adjective phrase or an ordinal or a quantifier or even a predeterminer or even a preposition phrase. So we looked at different kinds of noun phrases and we saw that in a noun phrase the only constituent that was obligatory was a noun. The other constituents were optional. They were there in some of the noun phrases, they were not there in some of the noun phrases. Therefore, when we wrote a rule for the noun phrase, we indicated that all things that were there in the noun phrase other than a noun were optional, and to indicate that we used round brackets. Then we also wrote a rule for the determiner. We saw that a determiner can be either an article or it can be a possessive marker like his or her, and we said that both cannot occur at the same time, and therefore we say that they are alternatives. So a determiner can be either an article or a possessive, and therefore the rule for the determiner was written a little differently. We used curly brackets to indicate that they are alternatives. Then we looked at auxiliary verbs. We saw that in a verb phrase auxiliary verbs occur before the verb, and we saw that there are different kinds of auxiliary verbs: modals, perfective markers, progressive markers, and possessive markers. And we said that we considered them to be auxiliaries because they can be used as operators, that is, they can be moved to the initial position of the sentence to make a question, or we can make the sentence negative by adding a not to the auxiliary verb. And then we saw how a progressive verb, for example, has two parts, be plus a suffix like ing, or a perfective has have and plus en, and a passive has be plus en, and how these suffixes are attached to the next thing in the verb phrase. So this is what we learned from this module, and I'm sure after going through this module you will be able to analyze a simple sentence, and you will also be able to analyze a verb phrase with auxiliaries, and you can also draw tree diagrams for both noun phrases and verb phrases. For more information about what we discussed in this module, you can please visit EPG Pathshala. Thank you.